On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the deal to avert a partial government shutdown, the latest read on the economy, and the Biden administration CHIPS Act rollout. Joining us is Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, welcome back.
Great to be back. I missed a week.
I know you missed a week, and this is the first time in two episodes that we're back in the studio. Because we had,
oh, that's right. Yes,
we did we were with Laura Collins 4 weeks ago now, I guess, and
Michaela last week,
and then Michaela and Gordon last week. So we're back in the studio.
Great to be back in the studio.
Seeing face to face, it's just a little better seeing each other face to face than there is, doing over the internet or over Zoom or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, we'll continue to believe that.
Okay, well, that's uplifting. All right, so before we jump into today's episode, what's been on your mind?
Well, I sometimes find out what's been on my mind by reading what I've written, and I seem to be obsessed with the treatment of mergers and acquisitions this week, and so. This is not a new issue. The FTC and the DOJ have new merger guidelines, and they have tossed to the wayside the consumer welfare standard. But now we've got some situations where I think it really makes sense to use it. And so I wrote on the Capital One Discover proposed acquisition. Capital One acquiring Discover. This is being portrayed as one huge financial institution combining with another, and oh my God, that has to be horrible. But if you think about it, as banks, and they both are banks, Discover is actually a bank and offers a full range of banking services. They go from being little banks to being the sixth largest bank. They're by no means a giant, and they're much smaller than like a JP Morgan. So the cost of having a bigger bank is what's the systemic risk and the probability that there's the need for a taxpayer intervention, things like that. That seems to me trivial. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it will now produce potentially a bigger competitor for Visa and MasterCard in the payment services market. And so, Discover has its own network. Capital One is a big issuer of credit cards. You run those credit cards across a different network. Now Visa and MasterCard have to respond. Maybe we get lower swipe fees for both merchants and customers. Those things are generally considered benefits. I would like to see a serious calculation of costs and benefits, and not hysterical letters mm-hmm. from Congress to the regulators. Yeah. So that's what's been on my mind.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, maybe fewer of those junk fees that the administration likes to talk about as well. I mean,
instead of the sort of credit card competition legislation where you do price fixing on those fees, let the market drive them down.
Yeah.
That's
makes a lot of sense.
That's the way I think about it.
And then more broadly speaking, I mean, this is nothing new. This is their game plan from day one. I mean, they were going to change the way we looked at the consumer welfare standard.
But they, this is my philosophical problem. They threw it out for what?
Yeah.
Like there isn't an alternative principle mm-hmm. on which the review is grounded, and so. It's literally an unprincipled approach to mergers, and I don't like that.
Yeah,
tell me what the principles are, and let's execute.
It seems like we're reviewing every single merger that is going to happen.
We're also trying to stop any merger from happening. It's really quite remarkable.
Interesting. Well, it's something to keep an eye on, and I think you've written about it already 2 or 3 times in the last couple of weeks.
I wrote about financial services. I wrote about the supermarkets, Kroger and Albertson. That's in the Daily Dish. It's the same argument each time.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to what's happening literally right now, and that's this week's deal to avert a March 1st shutdown, government shutdown. Yeah. Could you what is the deal that we that we had? I mean, they're saying this is a partial deal.
What we had.
Yeah.
We had continuing resolutions for 4 of the approach bills to March 1st, and for the remaining 8 to March 8th. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to get those bills done by those deadlines. So instead, they have reached an agreement, which we have not yet seen and which has not yet been written down and released, but there's an agreement on 6 of the approach bills. And there's an agreement yet to be reached on the remaining 6. So they're going to pass a CR for the 6th they have an agreement on to March 8th. And they're going to pass a CR for the remainder to March 22nd. And those, so presumably we will see between now and March 8th, so that's essentially a week, we're going to see 6 appropriations bills put on the floor of the House and voted, presumably under suspension of the rules, which would allow for no amendments, but and you need a 2/3 majority to pass them, but Democrats will support in those circumstances. So Speaker Johnson is now rolling the dice on getting enough Democratic votes to get it over to the Senate and risking his job, right? This is the scenario we've seen before.
Right.
All of that is pretty silent on how do you get to agreement on the other 6.
Yeah.
Like, and you know, Gordon Gray, who does, you know, our budget stuff, you know, he and I have now just decided that every time they say they Congress is going to get more time, we should just say they're going to get more rope, because they're not ever actually coming to agreement.
Yeah.
And now they're just running the same playbook.
It's that you got to have the autocorrect in Microsoft Word, if anybody remembers how to do that. Find, replace. What are the policy hurdles that they have to overcome? Like, what is the argument about? I mean,
the principal argument is, you know, appropriations bills are money. This is the budget authority and outlays that we expect the agencies to execute and the programs that will be in them. And then there are also policy riders, which typically take the form, no sums may be used for purposes of X, and X is something that one of the parties dislikes. Mm-hmm. The House Democrats, particularly the conservative core, have been trying to impose policy riders on a lot of these bills that are related to either conception issues surrounding now IVF, but also abortion, things like that, southern border, all sorts of hot button social and other issues, and the Senate's not going to agree to them, and so it's an exercise in futility. And Johnson has finally just decided we're not going to go as a Republican majority. We are going to go this suspension of the rules route and get the work done.
Yeah. So are we just basically at this point, given the politics and the election and all of that, just looking at continuing resolutions for the remainder of the year, or is there any hope that we can get those?
I think that there's hope to get the approach bills in, that they will go this route, because if they have a CR for the full year, it gets cut back, right? That was part of the deal back in the debt ceiling and what's known as the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If there is a CR in place in April, there's an automatic across the board cut to both defense and non-defense discretionary spending, and it's a big one on the non-defense side, and that's intolerable to Democrats in both houses, includes some Republicans in the Senate. So most people don't want to end up there. So this is a way to get around it.
Interesting. Let's turn to the economy. One of our favorite topics, our perennial topics, the state of the economy.
It's always
there. It seems to always be there, doesn't it?
Yes. Keeps me in business.
Yeah. I guess for those like yourself that have an economics degree and are an economist, that's a pretty good thing to have around.
Yeah.
This morning we got sorry, I need a second. I cracked myself up there. This morning we got the personal consumption expenditures report, or PCE report. Yesterday was the revised GDP report. I think you said a lot of snoozers there, you know, pretty much everything expected. And then Tuesday was the durable goods report. What do we learn from this latest round of data?
Mixed picture. So the things that I consider to be good news in this are when they revised the GDP accounts, they changed the top line growth from 3.3 to 3.2. So that's a yawn. But the composition changed fairly significantly. Non-residential fixed investment, which I have been tracking very closely, was revised up from growth of about 0.4% to 2.4%. So investment spending looks much stronger in the fourth quarter than it did before. That's the biggest good news in there. The bad news on that front is that the durable goods orders that came in most recently were quite weak. And so will that continue is still out there, but we're starting from a higher base, and that's a good thing. The other good thing we got was very solid real personal consumption expenditures in the data that was released this morning. But we have seen a real sharp downshift in growth of real disposable income. It was growing at about 4% year over year. It's now down at 2%. and that's happened rapidly. That's worth keeping an eye on. Like, can you keep up the strong household spending, which has been very solid at the 2 to 2.5% rate? So those are the things that are going on. Consumer confidence was also released this week. It was down sharply in February. That's not a great thing. And, you know, when you sort of look at the picture as a whole, we always come back to inflation. And the inflation data this morning were right where everyone expected them to be. Core PCE inflation measured both the regular way and market-based core. So toss out all these things we worry about in imputing house prices. It's now 2.8%, down from 2.9%. And it can't be something weird about the shelter stuff because this is all market-based reading. So that's not 2. That's why the Fed's not moving down, but it's continued progress.
Yeah. So between now and the next podcast recording, we're going to get jobs. We're going to get a few other reports next week, the jobs data next week, and all of that. Anything we can surmise from those reports ahead of time? Anything to expect?
I think we're going to continue to see a fairly strong labor market.
Yeah.
I just got off a briefing that some of the CBO guys did. It's an off-the-record briefing, so I can't go through the details, but it's basically looking closely at their baseline projections and the role of an immigration surge in them. And one of the things that I've noted in my writing is we've seen a big surge in the past couple of years. Their estimates are even bigger than I thought, and they're in their demographic report. And if you think about how that works, people come across the border, and they have to wait usually about 6 months before they can get a work permit. But they come across the border and they have to eat immediately, and they have to have a place to sleep. That probably explains the sustained inflation in the shelter component. It's the demand component. And ultimately, the labor market supply shows up, and the jobs are continuing. So I think there's a lot more strength in the economy from that than we appreciated. I think that's really the bottom line.
Until quite recently, we were predicting the Fed would cut rates in this year.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean, June has been thrown out a lot. I don't know if that's on the table anymore, given the data. What is your prediction for the remainder of 2024?
I still think that it's sensible to imagine them moving down this year. I mean, they would characterize their monetary policy as highly restrictive. It's doing its job in leaning against the demand that's out there. But the demand, in many ways, is expected to weaken. We've seen, disposable income go down. We've seen somewhat of a modest decline in the personal consumption expenditures. The investment's not super strong. So there's a case to be made for cutting when inflation hits the 2% and is perceived to stay there. And so that's what they're looking at. Now come the complications. It's an election year. The Fed really doesn't like to move close to elections, either direction. Like, that's a place where you want to go through. The presence of the election looming out there in November makes you think, okay, what's the latest they can cut, or do they have to wait till after the election?
Yeah.
And that's what the data are going to tell them. Like, if we get really strong data between now and June, they're going to be like, okay, we're on hold till after the election.
Yeah.
If we don't, then you might imagine them cutting in the summer and then shutting down the shop in August.
Right. So the months are June. And what's between June and October? I know October's one. Is there what?
There's one in there in August. They can get another one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jackson Hole. There's always
the Jackson Hole meeting that they do. Interesting. Well, that'll be one. We'll have to keep a close eye on the data, and it'll be something that as we do the weekly economic trackers, we'll have to keep an eye on. But it's time for the return of your favorite section, which has taken a 2-week hiatus. This is the trivia section.
I haven't been studying. Okay, this is going to be great. Okay.
Yeah, this one should be up your alley. It's debt related, so we'll see how you do. According to new projections from the Congressional Budget Office, the national debt will eclipse the highest levels in U.S. history by the end of which fiscal year?
2025.
Close. 2028. So pretty close.
Well, interest exceeds the Pentagon in 2020 by the end of 2024 now, which is shocking.
That's not a good shocking number.
Right. All of this is
a
bad.
Shocking number. I mean, so this is just, as we talk about, the fiscal funding the government and all that, there's a much larger conversation that has to happen underneath that, and that's how do we deal with the growing national debt?
Yeah, this is long overdue. I've been worried about this for literally years, and most of policy Washington has been ignoring it.
Yeah.
And it just can't anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I think, every time I look at those Gordon's budget chart books, it's getting closer and closer.
Oh, it's just shocking. I mean, but there are, let's face it, you need trigger points to generate action. We have a bunch. We've got the debt ceiling comes back next January.
Yep.
Get ready. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act 2017, most of that sunsets at the end of 2025. The corporate rate cut's about the only thing that's permanent. So that's a trigger. The premium tax credits, the enhanced premium tax credits, also sunset at the end of 2025. That's a really big moment because the fiscal hawk crowd is going to say, okay, let them both expire. We'll spend less and tax more. And the tradition has been, okay, we'll give you the tax credits if we get the tax cuts. And so which way is it going to go from a budgetary point of view?
Yeah, it'll be interesting. All right, let's end on another rollout, if you will, that happened this week. The Biden administration recently claimed the CHIPS and Sciences Act has attracted, let me get the number right, $640 billion in investment. You've disputed those claims, so walk us through it.
First of all, it's not just the CHIPS Act. They're counting the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, also the CHIPS and Science, and there are three. I'm blanking. So, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah.
So they're counting the three bills. This isn't actually investments; it's announcements.
Yeah.
And the announcements are happening now, but the investments might happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. We're adding them all up anyway, and they might not happen. Like, these are companies' announcements, and the world changes. So it's not as if we've gotten $640 billion and into the economy right now as a result of this. And even if we did, $640 billion is a really big number until you put it in the really big U.S. economy. The total stock of capital out there is about $66 trillion.
Yeah.
40 billion doesn't move 66 trillion very much, so we're not getting a huge expansion of capital services.
Yeah, I don't know if this was just an anecdotal thing you said, but what put it in perspective for me was, it was 2 months worth of investment into the economy. Like, ooh, yay.
Yeah, the private sector investments, a big number.
Yeah.
It's trillions every year. And so, this is 2 months worth. Right. I don't know which two. I mean, I would have gone for March and April, but hey,
it's why you have to compare it to the larger thing rather than just seeing that number. Yeah, of course, that's a big number to you and me, but when you look at it in the whole, it's not that dramatic. You've also
this is in fact why policymakers, politicians hate economists in the policy, because we're always saying things like, "Well, that's no big deal." Yeah. Okay, well, you just stepped all over my announcement. Thanks a lot, Doug.
Yeah. Well, it's one of your favorite stories to tell. Is when at your time as on the Council of Economic Advisors, job was basically just say no, that's bad policy.
Kill bad ideas.
Kill bad ideas.
Right.
Everyone likes that guy in the group.
Your job is to kill value subtracted.
Yeah.
That's it.
Very must make you very popular in the cafeterias.
Absolutely.
The CHIPS Act as a whole, you've definitely outlined numerous policy problems with it in general. Yeah. What are they?
Well, the original idea that sort of started this process rolling was the notion that we should manufacture in the United States those chips that are important for national security and defense purposes. So if they're weapons and things like that, they should be made here in a secure way so there's no question about their safety. That was the starting point. That was about a $7 to $9 billion problem. And now it got morphed into, let's subsidize chips of all sorts to the tune of $50 billion and build these factories in the U.S. And that's been argued that we need to do that because it's not safe to have them in China. Well, not China doesn't mean it have to be in New York State. I mean, it means it has to be not in China. Could be quite safe coming from Germany. Right. So this just turned into an industrial policy, and a handout. And if you look at the balance sheets of the people getting these grants, they've got their own $50 billion. There's no reason why they could not build those fabrication facilities here using their own money.
Right.
I don't think it's appropriate to have the government in there. But that's a passe way of looking at things, that have the private sector pay for stuff that they're going to benefit from. But I think they should.
Yeah, well, that's seems like a fair proposition for most people. Well, Doug, thanks for joining us on this episode of the AAF Exchange. I'm going to end on a little bit of optimism, and hopefully they can get a deal done before our next podcast. Not only because we want to keep the government open, but I don't know about you, but I'm sick of tired of talking about it.
Amen.
And it's time to talk about some new things on the podcast. So
absolutely.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.